Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you so much to the patrons who help make this show possible every day for you with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7. So we've got a lot to talk about with Bad Batch finale, and with the Tales from the Empire series dropping tomorrow, well, yeah, there's a lot to talk about. So we're probably going to prioritize some Bad Batch stuff. We will get to Tales from the Empire, and also we've got a little interview situation happening over the weekend as well. But for today, we're going to do what we usually do after a Bad Batch episode, which is our 7 takeaway breakdown of the particular episode, which is, in this case, is The Cavalry Has Arrived. This is episode 15 of season 3. First thing we'll do is our typical high-level recap of the story, which is proceeding from the cliffhanger that we were left with in the previous episode. But really, as we'd been talking about a few episodes ago, this is kind of the 4th episode in a 4-episode story arc, like they had done with some of the later years of the Clone Wars series. Hunter, Wrecker, and Crosshair are 5 kilometers away from Tantus and have to make their way on foot through the jungle. Wrecker is injured from a tussle with one of those giant creatures that seems to keep showing up in the Bad Batch. And they make it there only to be overwhelmed by Royce Hemlock deciding that now's a good time as any to release all of those CX troopers. Apparently they weren't ready prior to this, but now they're ready enough, I guess. And so the Bad Batch gets their hats handed to them, and they are captured and brought to the training room, quote unquote, to undergo the kind of torture that clones went through to become CX troopers or to be killed. Meanwhile, Omega, having spotted the Zillo Beast and aware that the Bad Batch is on the planet looking for her, says now's the time for the breakout. And so she leads the M-Count kids on a daring escape and frees the Zillo Beast, which, as expected, wreaks havoc on the base. Meanwhile, Dr. Carr has now fully U-turned and offered to help Echo get Omega and the M-Count kids out of the vault, except they already did it for themselves, and so they have to go around and eventually meet up with them. Ultimately, Carr and the kids are able to escape, and Omega and Echo go back in to free the rest of the clones and then go find where the Bad Batch has been taken, which leads to a final confrontation, first with all of those CX troopers who are eventually dispatched, but not without a lot of clones lost in the process. Then that clone commando Scorch, he ends up losing his life trying to protect Hemlock, stealing Omega away. And finally, in that one climactic confrontation with Hemlock and a handcuffed Omega, Crosshair having had his shooting hand cut off by one of the CX troopers, and Hunter waiting for their moment, knowing that Omega is going to give it to them. Omega pulls that very trusty little tool she stole from the medical tray out, stabs Hemlock, raises her binder cuffs up in the air for Crosshair to shoot free, and then they're able to take Hemlock out for good. And then we get 2 little epilogues, one where everybody's safe on Pabu and can actually finally breathe and release everything that they've been carrying, and then a second epilogue which happens as many as 16, 17 years later, possibly more, with a grown-up Omega who is wanting to join the rebellion, says the need for pilots is greater than ever, and discusses it with an aging Hunter who has gray hair, who is standing a little stooped comparatively, and still tells her, you know, if you ever need us, we'll be here. And you know, everybody has survived. Wrecker is still alive, Crosshair is still alive. Too bad we didn't get to see them in the epilogue, like I mentioned yesterday. And the story continues with Omega representing the next generation, bringing the fight to the big bad Empire. A lot happened in that episode, and for a second takeaway, I'll just flag the fun fact right away, which is that the episode was 50 minutes long, which really made it feel like we were getting 2 episodes. And so I know I've been saying, oh, it's like a 4-episode story arc. It's really more like a 5-episode story arc, the way that it broke down. And in fact, like, you know, as you're watching it, they really could have split it right at the moment where Dr. Carr took off with the M-Count kids and Omega and Echo went back into Tantus base to try and find all their clone brothers. Like, that would have been a perfectly fine breakpoint to do a 16th episode. So, it's fine that they did it this way. For a third takeaway, let's talk about one of the big ideas in the story, that the work that was being done at Tantus had to be destroyed. And the only way to do that, according to Nala Se, was for Hemlock to die and for the databanks to be destroyed. Now, that has ramifications across the entire Skywalker saga, potentially. And quite frankly, I was a little surprised that they did it. And probably, as I expressed in yesterday's episode, even more surprised by the way that they did it, bringing Admiral Rampart in and taking him out, having him shoot Nala Se ending up, blowing up the databanks with that thermal detonator. I mean, yeah, it ultimately really very carefully cleaned out those particular story threads, right? Like the destruction of the databank, and Nala Se's own knowledge can't be used against anyone, and then Rampart, his evil in the galaxy, has also been erased. So yeah, that was a very shocking and surprising situation, and it's kind of surprising that they decided none of the stuff was salvageable. But then again, for a fourth takeaway, it is fascinating to see all of the political stuff that happens, the machinations that are happening with the Empire, and Tarkin's showing up to say, hey, I've heard bad things have been happening here, so I'm here to investigate. Then he gets there and every bad thing has happened, and he tells his Captain Bragg, okay, yeah, well, let's take all the money away from this place and put it over to Project Stardust, which is, of course, the Death Star project. And it's also another moment where the Bad Batch has done some really remarkable work in connecting to other pieces of the Star Wars storytelling world, galaxy, if you will, right? I mean, we've talked about how they've connected to video games, and we've talked about how they connected to the sequel trilogy. Now they're connecting to Rogue One era stuff with this. And technically the original trilogy, of course, too. So yeah, the amount of connections that the Bad Batch has been able to make is really very incredible. It seems like it would be much easier to try to tell a story in isolation, so that way you don't have to worry about making sure that you've dotted every I and crossed every T. So yeah, that's something that I've particularly appreciated. For the fifth takeaway, I'm just going to talk about a couple of predictions that I had, like who was most likely to die by the end of the Bad Batch series, and I had said that for us to have any kind of closure, that Hemlock absolutely had to die, and he was number 1 on my list, and he went the way of the dodo. So did Scorch, who was number 3 on my list, and that was it. Nobody else in my top 7 passed away as a result of this episode, although Crosshair was seemingly thinking about it. I mean, there was a moment where he told the members of the Bad Batch that if all 3 of us go into Tantus, we're not all coming out, and he wanted to go alone and said that he deserved it. And of course, Hunter says to that, yeah, don't go all Plan 99 on us, right? Like, Crosshair was already thinking about sacrificing himself, and he was number 2 on my list, as it turned out. But I'm really glad that he did not sacrifice himself, and that ultimately he was able to have that redemptive moment. For a sixth takeaway, I'll confess that I am a little disappointed that we didn't get to see Asajj Ventress or Fennec Shand one more time in the series. Yeah, a bit of a bummer, but I kind of thought that's where things were headed when the Bad Batch hooked onto that science vessel and headed to Tantus. I mean, that pretty much took out the possibility that they were going to be able to bring reinforcements there. And so the cavalry arriving did very much turn out to be all of the clone prisoners that got released, because without them, our heroes would not have made it out of Tantus alive, and yet they were all the cavalry for each other. Omega helped the M-Count kids and went back for her brothers and went back for the Bad Batch. Dr. Carr went to help the M-Count kids. Echo went to help Omega. Omega went to help the Bad Batch. The clones went to help Omega and the Bad Batch. The Bad Batch eventually went to help Omega. They were all the cavalry for each other. So that's kind of a beautiful way for things to end as well. As for a seventh and final takeaway, the Bad Batch has certainly earned their rest. And whether they continue to rest after the events of the series, who knows? I don't find it likely that they are going to be just whiling away the time on Pabu. Echo is still active and out there. Rex is still active and out there. They're going to be resettling clones on Pantora, and Dr. Kara is going to be talking to Senator Chuchi. So yeah, it seems like there will definitely be work to be done and work available to be done. And I don't know if the Bad Batch resists the doing of it, but for now, for sure, they have earned a well-deserved rest. And I'm grateful that it seems that the Empire just, showed up on Pabu and then decided to forget about Pabu to let them be able to live in peace. It would have been unfortunate if they'd had to leave a garrison there, in the words of another bad guy. So that's what I've got for you on our 7 takeaway breakdown of The Cavalry Has Arrived, which is the final episode of season 3 and of the series of The Bad Batch, and that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please do share it with other folks you know in real life on social media. You can do that also by leaving a rating or review or hitting like, subscribe, follow, join. That tells the algorithms to show the show to other folks out there who might be searching for a daily dose of Star Wars joy like this. And you can also help the production of this show on a daily basis that goes out to, it's been downloaded in more than 160 countries, which is absolutely crazy in the nearly 10 years it's been on. But you can be a part of that too with your support at patreon.com/SW7X7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.